Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Loinger. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. So I'm really excited to jump in again today and continue talking about Cain, because we left off talking about how Cain had killed his brother, and then after that, God confronted him and he was punished. And then we talked about how he would have to be a wanderer. And we also talked about how he had a target on his back. So what's going to happen with all these things? So we're going to jump into the story again, starting with 4:17. We'll be reading from Genesis 4:17 to 4:24. So it's going to start off with the topic of sex, because Adam and Eve had some children. One of them was Cain, and the other is his deceased brother, Abel. But now we're going to talk about Cain's family tree. So we're going to read again from the Net Bible, and it says, Cain was intimate with his wife, and that's what I was referring to. She became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was building a city and named the city after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael was the father of Methushael, and Methushael was the father of Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives for himself. The name of the first was Adah, and the name of the second was Zillah. Adah gave birth to Jabal. He was the first of those who lived in tents, kept livestock. The name of his brother was Jubal. He was the first of all who play the harp and the flute. Now Zillah also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, who heated metal and shaped all kinds of tools made of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, "Listen to me, you wives of Lamech, hear my words. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for hurting me. If Cain is to be avenged 7 times as much, then Lamech 77 times." So here we have a few things happening. We have Cain's family tree starting to extend and grow, and Cain has a unnamed wife. And focusing back on something we talked about earlier, we had previously talked about how we're going to be mainly following the branch of the sons and the men, because that's where the family line usually comes through. And there will be some occasions where the family tree traces a woman, but for the most part, it's going to be mainly the fathers and then either their firstborn son or whichever son ended up carrying on the most prominence, or multiple of them. So here we have also a couple other things. We have a city being built, and we have one of his kids marrying multiple wives. And on top of that, we have some of the first instruments that were made and played, as well as the very first blacksmith, metal maker, and tool makers and weapon makers. And so, last of all, we have another killing story of one of Cain's children. And so, the person who killed the two guys that it was talking about, at least that's what the story seems to suggest. He's not Cain's son, but it's actually Cain's great, great, great grandson. So now that we looked at the major themes, let's go into a little bit more detail on them. We talked about how it doesn't say who Cain's wife was because, at least to them, it wasn't really important to the story. And of course, it would be really nice to know, but in the side of history, no one beyond those first several generations will know her name. And so she got pregnant with Cain's child, and they gave birth to a son named Enoch. And so basically, this very first son, there's a few things we'll talk about. Number one, don't get this Enoch confused with another one that's going to come later. So just giving you a future heads up. So Cain's son Enoch, his first and the only son that it mentions here, has a family tree of his own. So his son was Irad, and then Irad's son was Mahujel, and then Mahujael's son was Methuselah, and then the guy that we were spending a bit of time talking about, Methuselah's son, was Lamech. And Lamech was the guy who had the two wives and ended up killing someone. So here we have Cain, Enoch, Irad, Mahujael, Methuselah, Lamech, and then all of Lamech's children. So far we got Adam and Eve, one generation, Cain, second generation. Then we got Enoch, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we got 8 generations so far of stories, and it's possible that there could have been more mixed in there and just not recorded. But however, this is at least the point that is being pinned in the story, and 8 generations, at least from Cain's line, are specifically recorded. So the timetable was a little bit different back then, as you'll see in a little bit, because they lived much longer back in those days. And there's several reasons we can talk about in future episodes, but it doesn't say anything about that. So we'll talk about it when the Bible talks about it in just a little bit. So now we have Cain's son Enoch. It talks a little bit about him. It said that Cain was building a city that was named after his son Enoch. So there's a few things that we can take interest in here. Number one, this is the first city ever recorded. So obviously a city means a place that is bustling with people. It is a established and set location. It's not somewhere where there's a bunch of nomads pitching tents. It's a place where there is some set in stone buildings being established. So Cain is building one of these places. But wait, didn't we just go over that Cain was going to be wandering the rest of his life? What is he doing setting up a town? Maybe he was just building it and then moving on, but then he names it after his son. So that's another thing to note. So, number one is Cain screwing up by not listening to God and keeping on the move. Is something bad going to happen? Because he's like kind of subliminally disobeying God, but like not in a super overt kind of way. Like he's just not taking seriously one of the things that God gave as a condition that he would be doing the rest of his life. Obviously, we're just going to have to keep on reading. But I think we can see, obviously, later down the road, one of the things that comes about because of this city of Enoch, where it seems like they had settled, at least Cain's family, which essentially was, except for maybe other sons and daughters that Adam and Eve had, or possibly there were other humans that God made at the beginning and they were having children and civilizations were popping up other places. Not 100% because it doesn't talk about those things, but here we are focusing in. This is the only story that's something we need to pay attention to, that at least the Bible authors knew about or wanted us to know about. So let's at least zone into this and isolate it. So another thing I wanted to take a step back and talk about is both names and pronunciations, because since we're going to be talking about the Bible, obviously we're going to be talking about a lot of weird Hebrew names. And secondly, we're going to be talking about genealogies because it's a list of a bunch of people's names. And I think you could kind of see, basically, we were kind of just reading this list, and even growing up as a Christian, seeing these lists, they indicated to me that there was like something important there, but it was a little bit hard to get the picture. So I want to help you see the value of these lists of people. And I'll use a really great analogy that hopefully will connect and hit home for you. And then I'll also kind of explain it from a Jew's perspective, as well as how a Christian should also view this. And if nothing else, how, as someone who cares about history, anyone can care about these lists. So, first thing I wanted to establish is that the way I was pronouncing things was a halfway hybrid of a little closer to the Hebrew pronunciation, but still not even close to 100% authentic. Because one thing that was happening when we were reading, we had a lot of weird letter combinations, if you noticed, like CHs at the end of the name, but it kind of ended in like a K. And then we had like JAEL. It's like, how do you even pronounce that? Or we had some THs and SHs and other sort of vowel clusters mixed in there. And then we have Lamech and Ada and Zillah. And also, where do you put the emphasis? Is it Zila, Zilla, Zila? So even though we won't do a full lesson on how to pronounce Hebrew names, let me give you some tips and at least make you aware of what's going on with the names here. So let's start off with a really easy one. We had Adam, but in Hebrew, it's Adam. So the A's make usually an ah sound, but sometimes the letters, which are actually more of symbol letters in the Hebrew alphabet, they don't use the Latin text. They have their own Hebrew script. The Aleph can have several different sounds. It can be an A, it can be an O, and it even can be silent at other times. So, kind of like English, pronunciations changed based on what other letters are surrounding. So, it's kind of tough. And you just kind of got to start feeling and hearing more and more names as time goes on. So, my first tip is just go for it and start trying to learn. And if you don't care about pronunciations, let me just give you a little bit of information and then you can be on your way and you never have to be concerned about how you pronounce the names again. But I know that when we're either in gatherings of a lot of people in church and we're trying to help teach about a passage, or we really want to learn what that person's name was and how they pronounce it. Just like when we ask someone who came from a foreign country and they have a difficult name to pronounce, we want to try and learn that person's name accurately. A lot of people care about being able to accurately, or at least close to, pronounce some of these names. So for Enoch, his name was actually Hanok. So no way of actually knowing that unless you actually look it up on the internet or you look up the Hebrew text and learn how to read that specifically. But there's other ones that start to come a little easier. Like, for example, then Enoch's son, it says, was Irad. And basically, that one, the R's in Hebrew, if you want to sound really authentic, make a French kind of R sound. So, Irad, if you want to pronounce it accurately, but just Irad would work. And if you want to say Irad, then go ahead. He's not alive to get upset at you. And then we have a few that end with like this AEL. And I'll point out something in a second, but we have Mahujel and Methushael. So the thing about Hebrew is that there actually is no J sound. So it actually would be more like Machiel. And so you can see that the J makes a Y or an E sound. So if you want to sound really authentic and still kind of have an American accent, you could say Mahuyael. And the next one, Methushael. The word L, anytime you see that at the end of someone's name, including my own, my name actually comes from Hebrew. Michael actually has that very same ending, AEL, at the end, but it's actually an Aleph, which is like an A, or you could say E, and an L, or Lamet. And so together, those make EL or AL or AEL. And the word L in Hebrew means God. So my name personally means who is like God, because me means who or like what thing. And then the he is the word, or basically the preposition as or like, making a comparison. And then L Michael. So there, you guys hopefully learned something a little bit new. And if your name ends in AEL, then you most likely actually have a name that stems from Hebrew. So then we come to the next one, which is Lamech. And this one I wanted to point out is kind of like the Enoch, where we have that CH at the end, even though Enoch's is kind of uh, basically tricking us into thinking that we're saying his name the original way. They came up with a new way to say his name in English. So the good news is Lamech's name is not the same. It actually is just the way that it looks. His name is Lamech. But you hear at the end, I didn't say Lamech with a hard K. It's actually more of a back throat guttural sound. So whenever you see a CH or even a K at the end of a name or a word in Hebrew, most of the time it has a ch sound as opposed to a k sound. So instead of Lamech, it's Lamech. And so again, probably none of you are going to go to a Bible study group and try and show off and pronounce all the names correctly, because most likely, unless you're good at speaking Hebrew, you're probably going to mess it up anyways. But at least you have a little more knowledge now on Hebrew, because this is the foundational language which the scripture is written. So it's helpful to start kind of getting a little bit used to the feel of the language and how it sounds and why the names look so weird and different. And then I wanted to just go through the last few examples, and we'll talk about these guys and then their stories. So we have Jabal, and again, someone with a name that starts with J. There is no J in Hebrew, so it's actually Yabal. And then we have Jubal, which is obviously very similar, and basically his name is almost the same, just with one letter difference, and it's Yubal. So there you have some of those things. And then we have another concept that I wanted to talk about. So those two that we mentioned, we get back to the family tree now, and we have Lamech and Adah, which is his wife. So the first wife since Eve that is named. So it didn't say who Enoch's wife was. It didn't say Erod's, Mehujael's, or Methushael's. But Lamech, it does give the name of two of his wives. And who knows if he had even more. I don't know. Maybe some of these others did, but it doesn't give their other children's names. It just follows this one path because it's trying to lead us to some important figures. So it leads us to Jabal and Jubal because these two, Jabal was the first to really live and pitch tents and raise livestock as basically a nomadic tribe. So basically, Jabal was off as a nomad, and his people obviously were not full-time settling in this city of Enoch or Hinoch. We have instead him, like it says specifically in verse 20, it's saying that he was the first of those who live in tents and keep livestock. But I also wanted to take a step back again because didn't Abel raise livestock? And the answer is yes. And the question is, isn't Cain supposed to be the one wandering and pitching tents? And the answer is also yes. So, is the Bible always exactly literally pitching every idea in a very precise way? And from all the times that I've read through scripture, a lot of times they exaggerate a little bit on some of the story elements, just like we do when we get excited or we're talking about something. We use words that emphasize something in not a precise kind of way. So even though there were other technical firsts, like Jubal was the actual first guy who got into the nomadic life, if that makes sense. So I think this is the point it's trying to make. Instead of taking every word and scrutinizing it in an English sentence, try to take a step back and understand the bigger picture. And so we have a few things coming together. Like, this is the story of early history and humanity as we read it. We have people making sacrifices, having gods. We have Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. They commit sin. They're offering sacrifices. We have Cain committing murder. We have a city, or maybe even cities, being built. And then we have people who are living the nomadic lifestyle, and tents are beginning to be made. And we can obviously tell when it says livestock that they were the first big time farmers and hunters and things of this sort. But as we talk about hunter and gatherers, Jabal was the first one, and then Jubal, his brother, it says was the first one to play the harp and the flute. And when it says the harp, basically some versions say lyre, not as in someone who lies, but the lyre, which is a stringed instrument. And so basically the first early versions of guitars, were on the scene only 8 generations into humanity. And who knows if they kind of had been playing around with stuff even before that. But here we have, like you said, the first melodic instruments, at least that are mentioned, and the first ones that can carry melodies. And so we also have the woodwinds, and we don't know if it was exactly a flute as we know it. It obviously was some kind of flute type instrument or some kind of woodwind that was made, because that's what it's referring to here. And then those, are Lamech's and Adah's children. But then, if you remember, Lamech had another wife. So with Zillah, he had his son Tubal Cain. So right there you can see his name is kind of similar to his brothers. We have Jabal and Jubal, and now we have Tubal. So you can see that a lot of the names are very similar, but we not only just have his name Tubal, but it's Tubal Cain. And we obviously have a reference or a nod to great, 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 great grandfather Cain, or as his Hebrew name was, Cain. So we have Tubal Cain, and it says that with him, the thing that he was popular for, his people, was essentially metal making. And so he was really the first one to start forging tools, probably weapons. And I'm sure that he was one of the first merchants or businessmen that had gotten established at the early time of history. And if you think about some of the connections, we had the name Jubal, and what Jubal was famous for was the harp and the lyre and the flute. And these are all melodic and very upbeat sort of instruments, and something that really can lift someone's spirits. So I think it's cool because, in English we have the word jubilee and it sounds similar. So whether or not there's a connection there, I find this kind of stuff interesting. And just thinking about it, we have Tubal Cain. It said that he worked with metals like bronze and iron and all of these things. And if you think about other instruments, you think about the tuba and tubal, tuba, is there any kind of connection there? Again, I don't know, but I think it's kind of interesting because obviously words have changed and morphed, and people have taken inspiration from previous languages and generations. And you can see some of that within even these very first early people who lived. So before we get into the last story that comes in verse 23 and 24, let's talk about genealogies real quick, because you might have been just barely sitting through what I've been talking about so far, but I think that maybe you're kind of starting to get that, there's actually some interesting stuff in here if I actually dig. And that's what I want to point out is, for a 21st century Westerner whose culture is totally lost and unplugged from the ancient Hebrews, some ancient family tree list, doesn't seem to mean like anything. Like, boring. I don't I don't want to read and waste my time with this stuff. I'm not going to get anything personally out of it. But that's the wrong mindset. Just imagine if you were acting in a movie. As an actor, you obviously have coworkers and colleagues that you act with. And let's just say you finish up the movie and you get to finally watch the end product of the work that you and your colleagues put together. And at the very end of the movie, you're looking at the end credits and you're like, oh, yeah, yeah, Joe, I remember him on set. Oh, yeah, yeah, that camera guy, Ned. Oh, man, I remember that guy. He was pretty fun to work with. Or, oh, man, how can we forget the director? He was such a nice guy, and he'd bring me coffee to work every day. And it was a pleasure working with him. Like, these guys were like family to me. So obviously, you can see that to someone like that, there's a huge emotional connection to it. But what do you notice in the opposite respect is missing when we talk about it from our perspective? A lot of times, people that I talk about, they're like, yeah, I skip over the genealogies. I'm like, dude, don't you realize that this is as a Christian or as a Jew, this is your family history going back to the very beginning of time. Like, how are you not interested in these people? And of course, it doesn't say a lot about them. Like, you don't get to read their full on biography, but you get to learn little things like Jabal was the first nomad. Like, cool. Like, I'm going to tuck that away in my mind. Nice to meet you, Jabal. Jubal. Oh, he was the first musician to come on the scene. Like, that's awesome. Like, super cool to get to know this guy, even though I never got to meet him. It's like I'm getting to know him. Or Tubal Cain. Like, man, I love working with my hands. Like, the first metal maker. Wow, I work in a factory and we do metal die casting and creating tools and all this kind of stuff. So, wow, that's awesome. It all started with Tubal Cain. That's so interesting. And, Tubal was also named after his great 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 grandfather Cain. Like, that's pretty interesting, a lot of times families, they keep a name in the family, and sometimes even after 4 generations. And here in this case, it's like 7 generations. They give a nod back to one of their great ancestors. And so, with that speaking, like, I think you can see how this is starting to become so much more significant and interesting. And my challenge to you is, next time you read a genealogy, expect some exciting stuff. Like, expect to try and find who their parents were or who their grandparents were. Like, that's significant, and it might come in handy to know later in the story. Or, get to know what kind of things that person was famous for. Just like we do history class, like, this is a history lesson right here, getting to learn who the first nomad was, getting to learn who the first musician was, the first metal maker. These are all pretty profound and cool things. And of course, they're not going to teach it in textbooks because a lot of people do not view the Bible as valid history. And obviously, everyone is up for their own opinion and interpretation, but this stuff doesn't need interpreting. It's giving a list of actual ancestors. And of course, there are sometimes exceptions and quirks, and things don't always line up easily, or it's hard for us to calculate or figure out in what way they were putting these genealogies together. But there is still truth behind the people, the stories, and the time frames themselves, at the very least. And the question would be, why would they spend all of this time making up arbitrary names for all these people? Or why would they spend time coming up with hidden code names when really it's an overall narrative and it's trying to tell a story? Obviously, a lot of the names do have significance and do mean something, and then you can take that to the next layer and the next level. But other stuff, like Zillah and her son Tubal Cain, like, it's not trying to give you some secret code to calculate the signs in the sky so you can figure out when the apocalypse is coming. It's like, some people take some of these things way too far and they turn scripture into something that it's not. But one thing that this is meant to be is reliable. And the thing that I'm trying to do with this time is to help you see in what ways you can find the reliability, and you don't have to worry about that aspect. You can zone into the important details and pick away the right lessons that it is trying to teach and not go down unnecessary rabbit trails, but at the same time, not come to the conclusion that, oh, this is just a boring list. There's nothing here. There is a lot here. And so trying to, as I like to say, not be balanced, but be correct, because there is one thing that is meant by these genealogies, and that is for us to learn about the ancestors and who the family line is, because it might come in handy later or it might not, but we'll talk more about that later. So let's end off with this. We said we would talk about that story with Lamech and his two wives, and him telling them that there were two men who tried to wound and hurt him. And one of them actually did wound him, it says. And then it said a young man hurt him. And when it says a young man, like, don't be thinking that there's like some young innocent kid that was playing around and accidentally burnt him, and then he was so mad at the kid that he killed him. Like, when it says young man, it is referring to an actual man still. Like, more so, you see young people or even child soldiers, that are teenagers who are drafted as warriors or into terrorist groups or gangs, and they go out and are murdering people and just killing people for no good reason. And it says that Lamech was essentially attacked, and obviously if he's getting wounded and he's telling his wives that, hey, this stuff happened to me, then obviously it's pointing to the fact that Lamech wasn't trying to most likely look for a fight. Someone attacked him. So then in the next verse, it talks about this avenging, the 7 times being avenged that we had. If we go back to verse 15, the Lord said, all right, then, if anyone kills Cain, Cain will be avenged 7 times as much. And here, Lamech is saying that, hey, people were trying to kill me. And Lamech is Cain's grandson 3 times down the line. So great, great, great grandson. So he's in the family line. People probably have some hate for him too. And who knows, maybe it's because of the multiple wives thing. He is the first one that's recorded as that. Maybe he has a target on him. Maybe it's for some other reason. It's not said specifically why. Maybe people are just getting at Cain's great great grandson because they can't touch Cain, they know, otherwise they'll be punished. But they think maybe we can get away with it with one of his grandchildren. But it ends up turning on those guys, and in self-defense, Lamech kills the 2 guys. And unfortunately for one of them, one of them was young. And at the same time, that guy was trying to do the very thing that Cain did to his brother Abel. They were trying to harm and kill him. And so obviously, Lamech had the right to defend himself, even if that meant to the death. And sadly, sometimes that is the most just and fair thing to happen. at least the injustice was stopped right then and there. But then it says not only that if Cain was avenged 7 times, that Lamech would be avenged 77 times. So what's the difference in numbers there? That's times 10. So basically add a 70 in front of the 7. So we basically have a stack of double digits. So if the number 7 represents that God was going to completely avenge Cain, if he's going to 77 times avenge someone who tries to harm or do something to Lamech, that means he's going to obliterate and annihilate that person. Like, he is not only going to completely kill, crush, destroy, and ruin that person, but they're just going to be annihilated off the face of the earth. Like, when the number 7 is used, when you basically 10 times that, kind of like we were talking about, the Hebrews a lot of times used numbers in a symbolic way to communicate a message of emphasis. So, it's not saying that God would be like, oh yeah, you stabbed this guy once and now I'm going to avenge you 7 times, so I'm going to stab you 7 times even though the first time killed you. Or like, oh, you think you're tough, I'm going to literally stab you 77 times even though you're dead after the 3rd time. That's not what God is trying to say. It's more so the fact of just totally avenging Cain and his great grandson Lamech, who both had targets on their back. And that's where this part of the story leaves off, because the next section we're going to get back to Adam and Eve, because actually they have another son. And so now's the time to talk about the elephant in the room. So we have Cain. He's Adam and Eve's only son that's left over, right? Because Abel, we didn't really get to know him too much because he was killed off before anything got to happen to his family. Like, did he actually have a wife and did he get to have kids before he died? It doesn't say. It seems like the answer is actually no, because I'll give you a hint that there's no genealogy for Abel. It doesn't say Abel's one remaining son who survived after his father had been killed by his uncle. He went on to have all these kids. It doesn't have anything like that. So we're only left to speculate that basically Abel's family line was done before it ever got to really begin. And that's sad. So we have Cain's family that he's starting to grow a pretty big extended family now. And he's having children, or at least one child, it says, and lots of grandchildren as time goes on. And it's possible that he even lived while his great grandson Lamech was living, and maybe even got to hear the story of how someone had tried to harm one of his great grandchildren. So with that, we're going to leave it off and we're going to talk about the next son of Adam and Eve and hint, hint, that family line and more genealogies. Woo! So we'll get into that the next episode. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.